Greeting, friends. On behalf of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches, I'm very happy to welcome you to this virtual side event entitled the New United Nations Forum on People of African Descent, Realizing the Promises of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. The Commission offers this virtual side event in preparation for the very first session of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, which will take place next week from 5 to 8 December at the Palais des Nations of the United Nations office in Geneva, Switzerland. I will share later in the chat room the registration link. The murder of George Floyd in May 2020 and the following mass protests worldwide marked a watershed moment in the fight against racism. The year after, 2021, also marked the 20th anniversary of the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance that took place in Durban, South Africa. In light of these important milestones, the United Nations General Assembly adopted its Resolution 75/314, which created the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. The forum was created 7 years after the UN General Assembly resolution of 2014, which was calling for the establishment of a forum. Our Commission offers this virtual side event today to take us back briefly to the 2001 Durban Conference and its legacy, the decade for people of African descent, and now the forum. Some of the issues which will be raised will include: what are the lessons learned since the Durban Conference? Why did it take so long for this body to be created? What can we hope for with this body? And how can churches and civil society contribute to its work? And also the issue of funding of the forum, which is quite important. Today's webinar will be moderated by Reverend Dr. Jennifer Leith. She is the Assistant Professor in Black Religion and Queen's National Scholar at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Her research interests include Afro-diasporic religion, Black studies, ethics, and gender and sexuality studies. She is an itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and she was recently elected to the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches. Reverend Dr. Leith, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sigma. It is an honor to be with you today and to help to moderate and facilitate this conversation at this momentous time. And we'll just begin with a moment of acknowledgement. I want to be sure to acknowledge that I come from many places, but today I speak from land that was not ceded by the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and that the calls for justice with respect to race and racism extend to and through and beyond the African continent. And I'm grateful to be able to be a part of this conversation. I invite us to just observe a moment of silence at this time to acknowledge and to, in our spirits, pour libations for those who have been lost, who have gone ahead, and whose spirits walk with us and inspire and motivate and direct as we continue this quest toward justice and toward the realization of full rights and acknowledgement of complete humanity of one another, each of us siblings. Thank you. So this conversation is, in some senses, long overdue. As has already been explained, the demands and the invitation to action by way of investment in health systems, education, housing, electricity, drinking water, environmental control measures, equal opportunities in employment. These are demands that flow from the scourge of racism that are as yet unrealized. Two, the need for ensuring the access to education and to new technologies, in particular to women and children, and the inclusion of the histories and contributions of Africans and people of African descent throughout all fields and disciplines is, again, as yet unrealized. I'm grateful today that we have with us panelists who are prepared to lead us in a discussion that will help us to understand not only the Durban Declaration and the work of the Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, but we also have people gathered today who have been doing work in the field, in the trenches, in the communities, and who know exactly what's happening, and just how devastating racism and its impacts in our lives is. And so I'd like to introduce our speakers today, and then we'll turn the floor to them to hear more from each of them about what is going on, and especially and importantly what we are called to do going forward. So I'll begin with Dr. Iva E. Carruthers, who is the General Secretary of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, an interdenominational organization within the African American faith tradition focused on justice and equity issues. As founding CEO and a trustee of the SDPC, she has steered the organization as a unique, influential, and esteemed network of faith-based advocates and activists, clergy, and lay. Former director of the Black Theology Project, Dr. Carruthers has a long history of teaching, engagement, and community development initiatives and social justice ministry, fostering interdenominational and interfaith dialogue, and leading study tours for the university and church throughout in the United States and globally. Among many other positions, she currently serves as founding visionary and director of the Center for Reparatory Justice, Transformation, and Remediation, a partnership with McCormick Theological Seminary, and is working on initiatives related to the UN Decade of People of African Descent. She was delegate to the 2001 UN World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, and her publication, The Church and Reparations, was distributed by her denomination, the United Church of Christ, in several languages. To those of us who have benefited from her work and who have joined in the community that she has forged, she is affectionately known as Mama Iva to us. And Mr. Sushil Raj is a member of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. He is the Executive Director of Rights and Communities at the Wildlife Conservation Society, leading its global program to support Indigenous peoples and local communities for conservation outcomes, He has been a human rights and conflict prevention practitioner in philanthropic and multilateral spaces for more than 21 years. Most recently, he served as a senior director at World Food Program USA, starting with the Ford Foundation's Human Rights Program. Mr. Raj supported racial justice and minority rights internationally, including NGO groups in the lead up to and participation in the 2001 UN Conference Against Racism. Mr. Raj also worked as a senior program officer with the Asia Foundation in India. He spent approximately 14 years as a staff member of the United Nations, serving with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. In various duty stations focusing on addressing racism, Indigenous issues, minority rights, caste-based discrimination, and consultation consent processes. Mr. Raj subsequently worked in the office of the Undersecretary General of the UN Department of Political Affairs as a senior officer on planning and partnerships while enhancing analysis on minority and indigenous issues for conflict prevention and mediation, with a particular focus on developing the Secretary General's guidance note on land and conflict for the UN system in collaboration with UN Habitat. We're grateful, Mr. Raj, for your participation with us in this conversation today. And we have with us Marilia Alves Schuler, who is a Black woman of African descent, member of the Methodist Church of Brazil. She has a bachelor's degree in theology at the Theological College of the Methodist Church, a certificate on ecumenical studies of the WCC Ecumenical Institute at Bosse, and a master's degree in social sciences and religion at the Postgraduate Studies Center of the Methodist University of Sao Paulo. Marilia is a former executive staff of the World Council of Churches Program to Combat Racism from 1992 through 2006. And from 2007 to 2020, she has served global ministries of the UMC USA on missionary assignment to Koinonia Ecumenical Presence and Service, an NGO based in Rio de Janeiro. Now a retired missionary, she lives in Curitiba, south of Brazil. And so we thank you so much, Marilia, for being with us today. And we have the Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, who was recently elected to be one of the 8 presidents of the World Council of Churches. She represents the region of North America. In this role, she serves as the Senior Associate Strategist for Pan-African Orthodox and Ecumenical Faith Engagement at Bread for the World in the USA and DC. She brings extensive global, national, and local experience as a faith and public engagement thought leader, journalist, speaker, broadcaster, scholar, preacher, and author. She also serves as ecumenical representative for the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated. She received her doctorate degree from Princeton Theological Seminary and is the former executive director / minister of the Church Council in Greater Indianapolis, Indiana, and Church Council in Trenton, New Jersey. She has been a World Council of Churches and National Council of Churches governing board member, as well as a president of historic Black churches at Christian Churches Together, USA. And so we're grateful to welcome again Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith. And we have Reverend Lamont Anthony Wells, who is the program director for campus ministry in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Lumen. And Lumen is a network of inclusive faith-based and service communities on and near campuses at over 240 colleges and universities across the country. He is also the current national president of the African Descent Lutheran Association. Reverend Wells is the former assistant to the bishop, director for evangelical mission in the Metropolitan New York Synod. In his career, he has led programs and communities of multiple denominations in New York, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, including having served as the Lutheran campus pastor for historically Black colleges and universities in the Atlanta University Center. He most recently earned a professional certification, in diversity, equity, and inclusion from Cornell University. As a professionally trained coach, he effectively helps individuals or groups and organizations to unlock their potential and maximize their own performance. We are grateful to welcome also Reverend Lamont Anthony Wells, and I am so excited for the conversation that will unfold together as we talk today. And thank each of you for being here. Thank you for your commitment. Thank you for your service. And so at this time, I want to get right into the conversation. And I know several of you participated in the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance held in Durban, South Africa from the 31st of August to the 8th of September in 2001. The Durban Declaration and Program of Action was adopted as the main outcome and the document, if you will, of this conference. And it crystallizes the commitments arising from the complex global dialogue which took place by reaffirming the principles of equality and non-discrimination as core human rights, transforming victims of discrimination into rights holders and states into duty bearers. It is a roadmap in many ways with concrete recommendations for the international community to follow up on the agreed commitments. It indicates the steps that are to be taken to put an end to racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and to prevent their occurrence going forward and into the future. However, this document, we know, came and was received just a few days, 3 days before the 9/11 attacks in the United States. And with that came a rising fear of and xenophobia. And in some ways, of course, made these anti-discrimination texts all the more relevant. And on the other hand, and of course, in a strange irony, made them pushed them also to the back burner. And so I'd like to begin just asking Dr. Carruthers and Ms. Schuler and Dr. Raj, who were there, if you would, and helping to develop and later disseminate this work from the Durban Conference. If you could say a little bit about your involvement and your role, or the role of your church and organization during that 2001 Durban Conference, and what the lessons are that have been learned since the Durban Conference. Can we say there was inadequate implementation of the Durban document and the actions that it called for, or even marginalization in the human rights system, as well as the program of activities for the International Decade for People of African Descent? If so, why? And I look forward to hearing from each of you, and invite you to help us to understand this document and its significance. And also we'll look forward to following up as you have given response. And so, Dr. Carruthers, I'll turn it to you and invite you to share with us for a few minutes, and then we'll proceed in the order already specified.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jennifer. It is so good to be on this panel and to share our wisdom and our experiences with one another as we move this agenda forward. And I am very appreciative of the opportunity and for the hard work that goes behind the scenes to bring us these kinds of conversations. And I think that is one of the lessons learned. There are always untold stories that really help to inform where we are now in terms of what went on before, that will hopefully project us into a much better future. And that is really one of the major streams of lessons learned. I think that we are engaged in a struggle, a protracted struggle for liberation. And so this really represents a continuum. And so I want to affirm the ancestral power that is represented in this transgenerational forum right now. Each one of us come on the stories, on the backs of those who have brought us to this conversation of reparatory justice. And so when I entered into the Durban space, I was privileged to serve as an official delegate of an organization that had recommitted its resources and reset around the anti-apartheid movement. And so we were developing and raising funds for economic development for Black South Africans, because the white banks had made it impossible for Black South Africans to get access to capital. But at the same time, I was also a member of the Trinity United Church of Christ, which was a church very, very much committed to our mantra was what it meant to be unapologetically Christian and unashamedly Black. And so we were engaged in Pan-African ministries, justice ministries all over the world. And as an extension of that, I worked with our denomination to develop a study guide on reparations. And so I was also there because the work I had done, the Church and Reparations, was presented as a piece and then as a workshop. And it was done in 4 languages. And one of the lessons that was very clear was that language is a barrier, that part of what happens over generations in terms of systemic oppression is that we don't know our own story. And so to be able to create ways by which we can communicate with each other our own stories, we will be able to break down the barriers that have occurred because there's been intentional effort to make sure that we don't know our own stories and how our stories connect. The other thing that was on the ground happening, and it's very important for us to understand, is that the United States was quite intentional, insistent, and intended for the Durban Conference to fail. It withdrew any participation officially from it, and it actually went around to all of the delegates to strong arm them to vote against any recommendation that would suggest that the transatlantic slave trade system was a crime against humanity. Because by doing so, by establishing that, you had set the foundation for the demand for reparations. And so fortunately, there was a counter effort on the part of the Durban 400. I was an ally of the Durban 400, representing 400 African Americans from the US who had come in an effort to make sure that particularly the African nations as well as the Caribbean nations would not fall privy to the threat of the United States for them not to support the Durban Declaration. With much to do with a great deal of navigating the political waters, we were collectively successful. But can you imagine there were only 3 Black voting delegates from the United States on the floor representing civil society, and I was one of 3, only 3. And so we really have to understand how far we've come, and at the same time, how far we still have to go. Yes, the intent was to marginalize from the beginning, and therefore 911 only exacerbated and strengthened the hand to marginalize what would be the outcome. But it was very clear that the high points of us being able to meet each other with shared documents in multiple languages, understanding the gaps in our history, propelled us to this moment in history where we now have commissions all over the world of people of African descent. And now the permanent forum, which grew out of that legacy of Durban and then the decade. And these commissions are engaging with one another, sharing the stories, amplifying our voices, and accelerating the movement. And I think that is to be celebrated. But what we must underscore as lessons is that I think this group here that is gathered represents the diversity that we must hold on to, understanding that each of us has a part to do, and that the particular positioning of the faith community to call for the moral agency, the particular positioning of the faith community, particularly the World Council of Churches' courage to name Afrophobia for a time such as this, has made a major difference in our effort to propel the movement. But the point we must not miss is that we must hold on to our spirit, our hope, and our faith, and our power to do our part for this generation, understanding that we still have a lot to do. And it's going to be important that we step into this time where not only ideas make a difference that has to be mitigated, but technologies make a difference that have to be mitigated, as well as we have to be able to organize across our geopolitical differences with our shared values to move our agendas forward. It won't be easy, but certainly it is possible. And I'm just privileged once again to be a part of this conversation as we continue the resistance and the reclaiming of the humanity of all people and the creation of the world that we know God wants us to live in and be a part of. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crothers. Ms. Maria Schuler, yes. You're muted, and so I invite you to unmute.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Jennifer. It's a great pleasure for me to be amongst you today. And I have the honor to have here at hand with me the WCC report on the UN Conference Against Racism, Durban 2001. And we, at that time, together with my colleagues that were working in the program to combat racism, Bob Scott and Pauline Mushina, Eugenio Poma, also from Bolivia, and we organized several events in different regions of the world, because you all know that as a Council of Churches, we aim at bringing together the ecumenical family and the inputs and visions of the ecumenical family and the churches into this place that we are going to serve God together. So we hold several regional conferences, and we went to all the preparatory meetings, and we had a 35 persons delegation to Durban, having people from all regions of the world, indigenous peoples, peoples from ethnic minorities, women, Dalit people, so the Roma people, and obviously African descent people from all over the world, and Africans themselves that were also part of our delegation. We were led by the Bishop Mfume Dandala from South Africa. He was the head of the delegation at that time. It was a wonderful experience for us as the ecumenical family to be together and to share our experiences and understandings of racism in our contexts, and to be able to, by this sharing, to build a statement that addressed the main issues that were being dealt in the conference, but with this diversity of views from people from the churches all over the world. And I tell you, my friends and sisters and brothers, it was quite a challenge in so many respects, because we wanted to be an ecumenical front together. And as WCC, we were there to defend, if we want to say such a word, to defend the rights of all those peoples that were part of our delegation, and that we had a vision for the Durban Conference that it would bring new opportunities and new visions for the work that we were also doing in our particular countries, in our particular churches. And but it was a challenge in so many respects. And so I would like to mention a particular issue that was very very difficult to deal with during the Durban Conference. And that was not only the leaving of the United States delegation from the conference, but there was a polarization with regards to the Israel and Palestine matter in the situation. And so in so many respects, the media present at the Durban Conference didn't also help us in terms of highlighting the plight of so many peoples that were present there in Durban. There was a polarization, and in many respects, they were trying to hijack the conference in order that the conference would not come forward, especially the NGO forum, with regards to the support in upholding the struggle of the Palestinian people. And I very well remember that I was called as a WCC staff to give an interview with regards to the main points of WCC bringing to the conference. And I tell you, my friends, it was very, very difficult I would have to all the time to bring back the many other areas of struggle that we were there to support and to move forward, because there was a very strong media interest in polarizing the conference. And by the end of that interview, I was so exhausted. And in many respects, for the first time in my life, I was called anti-Semitic, because every time people were speaking about the Palestinian struggle, they were being named of anti-Semitic. And that was a very difficult experience for many, many of us in the churches, in the civil society. And so, but still, I want to celebrate that in Durban, we were people and people of African descent and Africans from everywhere. And that was a very powerful experience. And in WCC, in the work that WCC continues to do, we have this very strong commitment to highlight, to bring forward, to give platform to people's struggles wherever they are. And I commend WCC for its commitment to that. And I also would like to say that for us,
Thank you. We look forward to hearing what Marilio was saying there as she was closing, and as she returns to us, we want to invite Dr. Sushil Raj to at this time offer us the perspective of an independent expert on this matter.
Thank you, Dr. Jennifer. It really is a pleasure to be here. And as I hear the lessons learned and reflections of Dr. Carruthers and Ms. Schiller, I'm reminded of that day and that week that I was there in Durban. My involvement, and I apologize for the background noise which just started, so please forgive me. So my involvement was as a donor with the Ford Foundation, supporting many Indigenous peoples organizations, various racial justice organizations, minority rights organizations, Dalit groups who had also been advocating prior to and in the lead up to the World Conference Against Racism. And I was primarily present at the NGO forum, where the energy was palpable. It was really something to see the world come together and people's movements come together to talk about the racism and the legacies of racism that they had experienced and lived through. The conference generated a visionary document through the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which really brought global recognition to historic injustice. It established that colonialism led to racism, whose consequences persist in our present times. It established, as was mentioned, that slavery was a crime against humanity. And it established a clear linkage between poverty and racism. Some of these issues we continuously work on and advocate to address in the working group to this day, and will continue to do so as we move forward. It was very clear about what needs to be done to combat racism and discrimination, and had very specific recommendations on addressing the legacies and contemporary forms of racism faced by Africans and people of African descent, in addition to indigenous peoples, Dalit peoples, and many others who were present there at the conference. So you asked the question, could we say that there was inadequate implementation of the DDP, and what are the lessons learned? I'll share a little bit first about what we saw as some of the gains. So Durban catalyzed action at the international level. It certainly did, through various follow-up mechanisms, of which the working group of experts on people of African descent was one. It created many other mechanisms over time. However, it is very far from being implemented across many of the states for reasons actually cited in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action itself. In paragraph 79 of the declaration, it talks about the need for political will, the presence of weak legislation, the lack of comprehensive action by states, and the racist attitudes that remain ever present. And in our recent times, these combined with the increased rise of white supremacy, extremist movements, polarization of society, and hate on social media have pushed back or eroded some of the gains we have made. If we speak of the gains, 42 states adopted or amended legislation prohibiting racial discrimination, 35 established equality bodies, 23 states and regional mechanisms adopted national and regional policies against racism, and 26 states ratified the International Covenant for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The International Decade was established and its program of activities, and most recently, the Permanent Forum of People of African Descent. So although we saw structures being established, structural indicators of human rights, such as adoption of legislation, which were positive, these still required implementation in terms of process to deliver tangible change for people on the ground. And there are a vast number of states who have not taken up the Durban agenda at the national level, with no action plans, and where people of African descent are still struggling for basic recognition. So the other panelists did highlight some of the lessons learned, and I completely agree with them that Durban fell prey to the politics surrounding it and what followed in its aftermath. The entire agenda was dubbed anti-Semitic, even though it very clearly and squarely confronted anti-Semitism and racism against Jewish communities. It recalled the Holocaust and the right to security and existence of all states, while also recognizing the struggle for self-determination of the Palestinian people. So this anti-Semitic narrative continued to be posited in policy circles and built over time, which affected funding and full political support behind the agenda. The tragic coincidence of September 11, immediately after Durban, set in motion a chain of events which eventually led to a war on terror that dominated global discourse further exacerbated racial discrimination and Islamophobia and occupied world attention for more than a decade. And this took Durban from global center stage to the margins. On a day-to-day level, the DDPA was either not known at the grassroots in many countries or willfully ignored. Through our country visits, the working group continued to see deep-seated racial discrimination play out across national and subnational realities. We continued to observe deeply embedded anti-Black racism through institutions dominated by rules of representation and negotiation dictated by white supremacy or white Western cultural values in multiracial societies. This included manifestations of anti-Black racism through racial profiling, excessive use of force, and police brutality against people of African descent. The rise of hate, xenophobia, and populism also came forth in many countries as populist leaders took charge, spurring resentment, anger, hatred, and violence. The 2020 US movement for racial justice and the global movement for Black lives shined a spotlight on anti-Black racism and violence that had been present across all regions. In the Middle East and Gulf region, we continued to see common characteristics such as absence of disaggregated data, segregation in living, housing, access to health and public services, sexual exploitation and abuse of women and girls of African descent, institutionalized racism, forced labor. An example of this is the situation of the Al-Muhammashin of Yemen, who sit at the intersections of race, color, and descent-based identity and are relegated to impure or impious tasks. Their situation did not change after Durban. In fact, it is likely to have worsened with the war in Yemen. As they continue to experience both race and descent-based discrimination combined with armed conflict in their country, we do not know their numbers or what their situation is. For lack of disaggregated data, we estimate the numbers range between 500,000 to 3 million people. And in spite of a war on terror in Iraq for more than a decade, the topic of Black Iraqis never came up in nation or state building programs. Their numbers also range between 1.5 to 2 million, and Black Iraqis are historically linked to an era of slavery between the 9th and 19th century in Basra. They continue to face systemic discrimination in all areas of economic, social, and political life, with the constant stigma of being called slaves. So these are just some examples. They're emblematic, but they don't encompass all that is going on in Middle East, the Gulf countries, parts of Asia, and other places. So as a working group of experts, we repeatedly highlighted concerns and called on the need for disaggregated data with specific recommendations on what needs to be done to address disproportionate effects of anti-Black racism on health, education, housing, healthcare, employment, participation of people of African descent at various levels. We continue to repeat our recommendations over the years through our thematic analysis and country visits. The implementation of our recommendations, of course, depends on cooperation of states, their invitation to visit, and the availability of resources to the mandates addressing anti-Black racism at the United Nations and beyond. So yes, the DDPA implementation has suffered, but it remains an amazing global document that continues to guide our mandate as a working group, and collectively with other mandates, we continue to forge forward, sometimes through transformative, but at many times through incremental change to undo centuries of racism. And change is not linear. So we move 2 steps forward, we come 3 steps back, and that is the struggle we're all involved in. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raj. As we continue this conversation, I just want to acknowledge the following question from Nozizwe Madlala Routledge. When we speak about historic disadvantage, we are often told not to look back, but forward. How can we counter this call for us not to look back while those telling us this are enjoying a position of economic privilege as a result of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. I am grateful for this question that has come through the question answer function, and encourage others to offer questions, and we'll incorporate them to the best of our ability. And this particular question really nicely leads into the next question for the panel, which invites you to consider the fact that the history of this work, this anti-racism work in the UN, has been has had these fits and starts, as it were, and so through Resolution 6916 in November of 2014, it was decided to establish a forum that would focus on people of African descent. Yet it was 7 years later, in August of 2021, that the General Assembly finally adopted Resolution 75314, in which it formally operationalized the permanent forum. And so I want to invite panelists to reflect on this this history, if you will, and also to consider what was at stake with the development of the permanent forum. Most notably, that forum was established as a consultative mechanism for people of African descent and other relevant stakeholders, as a platform for improving the safety and quality of life and livelihoods of people of African descent, as well as to be an advisory body to the Human Rights Council. And I just wanted to underscore those elements: the safety, quality of life, livelihood, because of how great those stakes are. And so I'd like to turn to Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith and invite you to respond as one of the members of the International Civil Society Working Group that accompanied the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent for several years. Can you share with us about your role and that of churches in the lead-up process to the creation of this mechanism?
First of all, I would like to thank World Council of Churches for convening this space. And I would like to thank all of my peers who are here in this panel for their amazing contributions before and during this panel discussion. Dr. Lee, thank you for your moderation. It is truly, truly an honor to be in the company of such esteemed company, and to mark this moment, this historic moment that is before us. It was my honor to join in the coalition to advocate for the permanent forum. As was already stated, this whole 20-year history has been, well, really longer than that, 21 years, has been such a long journey of struggle. And unfortunately, as I understand the history, although I was not in Durban, it's been up and down all along the way. This is a very familiar pattern for people of African descent who have been up and down along the way, but resistant and resilient for their resolve, our resolve, to say injustice must end. So the pattern within, since Durban, is one that we are very familiar with. And therefore, we know what is before us, even as we adopt and implement the mandate for the permanent forum of people of African descent. So it's in that history of, if you will, both the challenges and the opportunities, but with great resolve and with faith, that people of African descent and our partners have gone forward. That was the case in order for the permanent forum to make its way, even in these moments. Just like the UN decade, just like going to Durban, after Durban, we are still at that moment of advocating for the principles and for the vision that is stated in the Declaration. I believe the Declaration gives us a wonderful foundation and platform in order to energize, to document, and to acknowledge the consensus that was built to pull us together for this moment. That document that was presented and created is a roadmap, as was already stated, that allowed us to say, this is something we've already committed to. This is a moment where we must push further the opportunities before us. Yes, as was already said, the very tragic murder of George Floyd and others, Breonna Taylor. I mean, there was a number of people in those moments, and continues to be, that who died in this struggle. Many were martyrs, if you may put it that way, because they were people of faith. They were people who understood that it was their faith that was guiding them and to be who they were, and we lost them. This is the tragic history of people of African descent and related groups that have been named. There are people who have died for these moments. So as we come to this moment, we're not only arguing the Durban Declaration, we're arguing the death and the life of those who have gone before us. I think Dr. Carruthers really helped us. We are building on the ancestors. It is the ancestors, it is our faith, those are ultimately the guiding points for what it is we do when we advocate for this moment, for the permanent forum. It is bigger than us. It is based on universal truths. I am pleased to see in the Durban Declaration, some of these universal truths are pointed out. These are, if you will, common values, moral agency that we have based on faith traditions, and of course on moral codes. And so the advocacy was built on that, not only the Durban Declaration, but the larger universal principles that all of us should be committed to if we want the kind of humanity, the kind of creation that God has intended for us. So for me, this is part of the universal struggle for all of God's people and for the creation. And that's how we built our advocacy for the permanent forum that followed the great work that went before us. The work is still before us. It won't be easy. It won't be easy to go to the permanent forum and know that it's not funded properly, to know that the forum does not have the kind of stakeholding of the member states. Ultimately, it seems to me getting the member states to do what is morally correct and legally abiding is what we are after here. And it is my hope and my prayer that the member states will open their hearts and look critically and say, yes, this is not only a time of profession, but of confession and repentance. I am very sad to go to the permanent forum and to know that my own US government has yet to apologize for the horrors of the enslavement period. And just as Dr. Carruthers said earlier, if they did so, they know there is a cost. Well, all of us, many of us have already been paid. It is time for all of us to stand up so that the healing and the reconciliation can come to pass. Thank you, Dr. Leaf.
Thank you, Dr. Walker-Smith. Thank you. And building on your reflection, I'd just like to turn to Reverend Dr. Carruthers and invite you to consider not only why it took so long, why it took 7 years for the body to be established, and the extent to which global protests in 2020 calling for racial justice accelerated the creation of the body, but also what can be done so that it doesn't take so long. What can be done outside of the shedding of blood for justice and for racial justice initiatives and demands to be realized and to be accelerated.
Thank you for that question. And this has really been a profound conversation that stimulates me to affirm, I think, that is often the hidden hand of spirit forces and ancestral power that propels the resistance and the resilience that suggests to me, in answer to your question, that what can be done is for us to continue to do better around organizing between the crisis points, between the points of media sensationalism, and to begin to figure out how we strategically, collectively organize the histories, the ideas, and the financial resources in order to put respective pressures on the nation states that we represent, and to help to continue to fuel movements on the ground that bring about real change and transformation and demand. And in doing that, I think one of the things we must focus on is the changing landscape of the movement that really makes a difference for impact and how we can be effective. And I think we've already begun to unravel, as we've thought about and reflected upon the 20-year history, for example, the role of media. The role of media is extremely important in ways that are new to us, that connect to what it means to be able to sustain democracies, to sustain educational systems that help all of us understand what is important that must be protected at all costs in terms of the values, so that there will be the moral agency organized to make a difference and to sustain what it means to be human. Another piece of this changing landscape 20 years ago versus now, and it was predicted, of course, 20 years ago, was technology as an extension of what we saw present in COVID-19 of medical apartheid. And that is now grounded in really genomic studies. It is no longer about Black phenotype. It is also about genomic presence and power, and the power to use the genetic material for purposes of good or evil. And so what does it mean that we now have to begin to focus on conventions and declarations about the disposition of genetic material? And how does that relate back to technologies which are using artificial and augmented intelligence to help create ideas, to help speak, and to do so in the hands of persons with concentrated wealth who have a commitment to reinvent systems of oppression and racism and white dominion that are driven by artificial intelligence, that is bots, that are driven by concentrated wealth, that is tweets, that are at the disposal of those who want to maintain their benefits as it relates to being the beneficiaries of systems of white dominion. Now, I think when we distill all of this at this point in time, it is really fair to say that this notion of a hierarchy of human value, that some people are more valuable than others, and therefore the issue of human rights and issues of democracy upon which the United Nations was founded is obsolete. It is antithetical to what those who want to sustain their power believe is in their best interest, compels us to, one, understand that we must know our history, in answer to your other question that came through, because it is our history which will inform us in terms of where we are and what we must do to be co-creators to move this movement forward. So there's a saying that one of my mentors used to say all the time: if you don't know your past, you can't know where you are in your present, and therefore any road will take you there. And that gets you to episodic successes. My grandparents would never have believed that people of African descent in the United States would have to remobilize around voting rights. And yet that is one of the most significant expenditures of energy that people of African descent are having to expend at this point in time. So I just think, in short, that this hierarchy of human value is manifested in different ways, in different generational experiences. And this hierarchy of human value now is being manifested in a changing landscape that is grounded in technologies around artificial intelligence, around genetics, and around concentrated wealth to control and propel that. That's one thing. But I also say that I've been struggling with this notion of what it means to think through what I call identity denial and identity delusion syndrome, where out of this notion of hierarchy of human value, there's this prioritization of whiteness metaphorically and whiteness in reality, which makes those who embrace it as a god delusional about where they are on the spectrum of humanity as sacred and in the secular world, and also want therefore to deny the humanity of others that they feel are inferior to them. The bottom line for us, I think, is that our history has taught us, our ancestors have paved the way for us to maintain and to continue our resistance, but to do so in a way that is systematic, that is organized, that brings together our own wealth and assets to continue to move this forward. And I'm just so honored and pleased that the brothers and sisters on this call and those who are listening, I consider to be comrades in this work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carruthers. Dr. Raj, I want to turn to you and invite you to also reflect in a bit further about why it took so long, why it's taken so long. And I know in your first response, you did give us a hint at some of the reasons and the explanations. And so with that in mind, I'd like to also invite you to turn toward that question of what we can do to make sure that we are moving at speed and attending to these matters and are not delayed or detained or detoured or detained with the organizational ups and downs and vicissitudes.
Thank you so much. As I respond to this, I actually would like to start with that question that was put forward to us on the past and not looking back, the history of our ancestors that Dr. Carruthers spoke about and spoke to. Going back to the Durban Declaration again, why it's so visionary and it embodies, as Dr. Carruthers said, the moral values and moral codes. It's very clear in one of the paragraphs, the importance of the truth of history. Who writes that history, from which vantage point? And we have seen history written from the vantage point of those in power, those who oppress. And for that very reason, it's important to share that history is what has led to intergenerational deprivation and has brought us to the place we are when we see these inequalities and disproportionate effects on people of African descent and on others. And that explains the deprivation. It also explains the exclusion of people from structures of power, from the international world, the international machinery, including the United Nations, where a lot of what was negotiated in the past was negotiated by those in power. And when we look at European delegates or North American delegates, they primarily came, they were primarily white and did not come from people of color or minorities or indigenous peoples. Now that has begun to shift and change. And I think that influences and has influenced a lot of the discussions that have taken place at the UN following the World Conference Against Racism. That combined with the politics of how bodies are established, how negotiations are carried out, I think contributed to the delay in the establishment of the Permanent Forum. as a working group, from the very initial days, we were calling on participation of people of African descent in all areas of public life, in all political, economic, social, and cultural aspects. Our 5th session back in 2005 had a focus on this. Our 7th session talked about the establishment of a voluntary fund to facilitate the participation of civil society organizations representing people of African descent in meetings and activities of the working group. And we repeatedly continued to call out for this fund and resourcing, which has been tremendously lacking in so many ways. We as a working group, of course, continued to listen carefully to the lived realities and the recommendations of people of African descent, while distilling these into concrete recommendations on what meaningful and effective participation means. And this led up to the International Year of People of African Descent back in 2011, and the development of a program for the International Decade. That's where the first concrete and specific call came from the working group at its 2012 session to create for people of African descent an appropriate tool for empowerment, which guarantees their meaningful participation and inclusion in processes. And as a result of the decade, the working group invited the General Assembly to consider establishing a permanent forum for people of African descent to serve as a consultative mechanism for representatives of people of African descent and other stakeholders. And then, of course, the work continued after this in terms of negotiations and trying to achieve this. The representative of Chad, who was co-facilitator to the negotiations of the draft resolution, captured the establishment of the permanent forum quite well. I would quote it, "It strikes a delicate balance among the various positions of member states and gives tangible form to an intention set out in 2014. Of course, the work was much before 2014, but 2014 is when this was formally included in a General Assembly resolution. And in subsequent years, there were various resolutions spelling out some of the modalities of the forum. And a consultation was held with civil society. Now, COVID and the pandemic took over for a brief period in 2020 and 21, which delayed some of the negotiations. But it was also a question of states objecting to some of the substantive mandates, such as elaborating a new declaration, which some states had positions, including the US, that it fell within the purview of member states. And for some, there was no need for a new international instrument. The European Union also talked about this. Others had reservations on the parameters for disaggregated data collection. And this is a key demand and recommendation, demand from many people of African descent, and recommendation of the working group through the years that without data, people are invisible. That's the first step in recognition. It's also important to bear in mind that data is not the solution. So one can be in a place where there is disaggregated data, but what one does with it, and then all the other factors that I spoke to and the Durban Declaration spoke to, the political will, the prejudice of people who are in power and their bias affects how policies are designed. So there was some resistance to the collection of disaggregated data, and that being mentioned in the mandate of the permanent forum, as well as the costs of the permanent forum. Ms. Angelique had just raised that point. These are bodies that are extremely under-resourced, and intentionally so. And that affects how discussions, how participation plays out. So there was resistance and a call to contributions to be covered under what is called voluntary, which is resources that are not covered through the regular budget contribution. So these were some of the reasons why it was delayed and why it took so long from the vantage point of where I sit and what I see. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your reflections, and I just want to remind us of the work of scholars like Ruha Benjamin and Dorothy Roberts that help us also to frame and understand the importance, the significance of data, and also the ways that that we might that we might combat some of the challenges that we're facing in the ways that Dr. Carruthers and Dr. Raj have just laid out, and to understand some of the contemporary fronts on which this struggle is evolving and taking shape. So at this point, I'd like to also turn us to strategies, strategies to combat systemic racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. In our world, the legacies of slavery and colonialism continue to manifest themselves in structural racism. And so communities of African descent across the globe live in structural discrimination, contexts of structural discrimination and structural invisibility, and are yet scarred by poverty, underdevelopment, marginalization, social exclusion, and economic disparities. So I'd like to turn to Reverend Lamont Wells and again to Ms. Marilia Schuler, and invite you to respond to this question, or these questions, if you will. How do you think churches can contribute to the work of this forum in challenging manifestations of systemic racism? How can they, or should they, make use of this new mechanism in their fight for racial justice? And as you're responding to that, I'd invite you to be mindful of the question and comment that Kristen Noel brought to our attention in the Q&A, which invites us to think about why ancient African and not so ancient African religious tradition is pushed to the side and not always incorporated, not only in ecclesial structures, but also in the broader landscape as we think about ways to combat racism, not within and outside of religious bodies per se. And so I invite your reflections, and look forward to hearing from you. And we hope that if he's able to connect, he's been having some trouble, but if he's able to connect, we'll also hear from Reverend Emmanuel Way. And so Reverend Wells, we turn to you.
Grace and peace. Again, thank you for this opportunity and this invitation to share. That's a full question, because I've been struggling, particularly being a rostered minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, often asking myself the question of why Absalom Jones stayed with the white church and why Richard Allen, went to the Black church. And I've been struggling which way I should have ended up going sometimes. Sometimes I love being here and sometimes I don't. But the reality is that the church that I love, the ELCA, does acknowledge that racism is a sin, and racism denies the reconciling work of the Christ, like all of those things that are effective strategies and understandings at base levels, foundational levels. But the work that we've been engaging in, particularly as people of African descent within the ELCA in this context, has been a struggle to elevate empathy and to demand action within the church. Particularly understanding that descendants of formerly enslaved Africans are still being denied equal access and opportunity in the church and society, while other people in dominant cultures or other cultures and populations collectively benefit from this unequal access and opportunity and even power. The reality is, even in the beloved ELCA, institutional racism still and currently exists through discriminatory practices and treatments with our call processes, the inequitable compensation of clergy of color, right? These are things that something can be done about. Racial segregation in various parts and conferences within our denomination. And there's a clear way that this is happening, and we're trying to address this, the divestment from Black communities. And we're trying to encourage more of a reinvestment of congregations, and also systemic policies and organizational practices that we're taking a look at. And the overall failure to fully include the gifts of leadership and worship styles of people of African descent. Dr. Jeremiah Wright used to always say, different does not mean deficient, right? And so, and with this, we've been living our lives within this church and community, struggling towards finding our place and stating our cause within this. So the ELCA, although has a heart, if you will, and a desire to participate. We were there December the 10th, 2014 at the UN, where the International Decade for People of African Descent was introduced. We send delegates next week and this week to Geneva, and our support of the Permanent Forum and some of the objectives of the International Decade, supporting leaders like myself to serve in candidacy as a UN fellow. But there are some harsh realities, and Dr. Leith, I'm looking at your bookshelf, and I said this to the church a couple of years ago, the quote of James Baldwin, I can't believe what you say because I literally see what you do, has been something that we've been particularly living in. Often feeling like we've been invited to the party, but not always invited to dance and to participate fully in the life of the church. So in 2015, a group of young people, and I believe that a lot of things always start in higher education institutions, and a lot of, particularly with people of African descent. So some of our young adults in our higher education network decided to write a resolution and memorial to the churchwide assembly, the 2016 churchwide assembly, calling on the church to draft a formal letter of repentance or an apology concerning the things of the church, like following in the way, using some of the language of the objectives of the International Decade of People of African Descent. And when that was presented to the church, it came back to us and basically said, write your own apology. And we had to rebuff that and say, no, we're not going to do that. But why I'm bringing that up is not to disparage my church that I love, right? But to talk about the level of education and intense engagement to engage processes like these that are needed. Mama Iva talked about, when you know better, you can do better, right? But I'm not quite sure that some of the things that have been engaged in the church is because they have not known better or acted as if they didn't. So we've been able to move the apology and the objectives of the apology forward. And some of the action items that have come first out of acknowledgement, which was the first thing that many people rebuffed against. So I just like to say that those kinds of actions that we have, introducing that we acknowledge the complicity of our engagement with slavery, creating study guides to help educate our members, having a deep review of our constitutions and policies and statements to see where there are racist indicators. We've established a study on reparations and launched that, and also a study on the disparities of discipline concerning people of color. So we've been looking at a lot of the things of how we can how we can deal with the understanding that we have of how we've treated each other and connecting them to these human rights principles that are a part of the Permanent Forum's objectives.
Thank you so much, Reverend Wells. Thank you. Ms. Schuler, Brazil has the largest community of Afro descendants outside of Africa. Would you be willing to share a bit from your perspective on this matter?
Thank you very much, Dr. Jennifer. I apologize for the fact that the Wi-Fi connection has dropped at some point, but fortunately it came back. I thank you very much for these questions posed to us. I would like to start my response by quoting a journalist and writer of Brazil, Laurentino Gomes. He says the following, and I totally agree with him. All that we have been in the past, all that we are today, and what we will be in the future can only be explained by slavery and slave trade. I consider this matter the most defining Brazilian history element. The reason why I wanted to bring this quote from Laurentino Gomes is because I have mentioned to you that we are around 56% of the Brazilian population between what here in Brazil they call pardos. So a pardo would be somebody like me with this kind of complexion, and blacks. So the census in Brazil has those two designations for African descent people in Brazil. Together, we are around 56% of the population. And the reality of poverty, of malnutrition, of joblessness, or low income jobs, and poverty, and favelas, and slums, and lack of sanitation, and you name all the elements of poverty that you know, and you will find those elements very present in the African descent Brazilian population. That is a reality to today. So slavery is slave trade. And when we were brought to Brazil and the Americas, around 12 million Africans were brought to the Americas, and being that more or less 4 million of those came to Brazil. So just for you to understand the impact of slave trade and slavery in our Brazilian society. So that reality, when slavery was abolished in Brazil, from one day to the other, the slaves that were freed did not have anything. No house, no money, no salary, no condition to go anywhere. And many remain in the places where they were at that time. Many were free already for some of the legislation that were passed in Brazil. But the reality I wanted to mention is that we didn't have anything. Suddenly, it's declared that the slavery is no more, but the people to survive had to go to the streets, to do menial jobs, to do all kinds of jobs, to be able to survive, to care for their families. And the reality of marginalization and poverty and favelization, that the slums of Brazil start very strongly with this reality of the African descent population. So I jump a little fast forward to say that recently, in the last not even 20 years, we started to discuss affirmative action in Brazil. And I tell you, my friends, it was amazing the resistance of the Brazilian society, many of the Brazilian society, with regards to affirmative action in terms of schools that people of African descent and indigenous peoples and also other minority peoples in Brazil would be able to receive the possibility of filling quotas for schools in the system, especially in universities. The resistance was enormous, but the change that happened is remarkable, is tangible. We can see what the benefit that it brought to the the African descent Brazilian population. So to say that issues and matters of affirmative action or reparation in Brazilian society are not yet strongly discussed. The Black movement, many sections of the Black movement are discussing reparations and how reparations could be brought into our daily life and the changes it will make. But we are still in very small steps into that. And also, I'm talking about churches, I would like to say the following. In many, many respects, the Protestant churches and also other churches, Pentecostal churches in Brazil, do lack awareness in terms of racial relations in Brazilian society. In many ways, the understanding that we are all equal before Christ takes away the reality that we come from different backgrounds, we have different situations, financial situations, in which the awareness raising about Brazil and our composition as Brazilian people should also be an element for awareness raising in the churches. Sunday school could be a space for people to be taught about that. We also, the method of recovering the presence of Africans in the Bible. Some churches have studies and are starting to be aware of that. But in many respects, there is, it's like African people do not exist in the Bible. The Bible is made of Jews in the history. So I'm saying this very simply like that because that understanding of the presence of Black people in the Bible is also an element that the churches, starting from there and moving forward and coming to the today reality. But I wanted to say, to affirm the importance that we have movement groups of African descent people in the churches, in the Methodist Church, in the Lutheran Church, in the Anglican Church, but also in the civil society, groups of African descent women gather together as Protestant women and discussing and addressing the issues of African descent people in the Bible and understanding a Christian perspective with regards to our Brazilian reality. And well, just to finalize my comments, I wanted to mention an important element that was brought before with regards on the chat with regards to the ancient African religious traditions, to say that one of the most important struggles in Brazil is really for religious freedom, because all African Brazilian religions are demonized, are considered nothing, are not taken into consideration. And the issue of religious freedom in Brazil remains a very crucial issue. And I would say an understanding, a teaching Protestant churches and evangelical churches and Pentecostal churches would be crucial also with regards to the rights of African Brazilian religions to exist. So religious freedom is a struggle, is still crucial for the Brazilian society. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Ms. Schuler. Thank you. And at this point, we're going to turn to the question of reparations. It's impossible to discuss racial justice without discussing reparations. And this has been anticipated also in the questions that have come through in the Q&A. And so I'd like to invite the panel with the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in mind, and particularly the commitment to leave no one behind, to address the importance of reparatory justice, and to specifically address in your respective contexts what justice looks like, what reparations looks like, how do these translate in each of your contexts, and what can the forum do to support and undergird your efforts. As we prepare to hear from the panel, I'd just like to acknowledge the questions that have come up, and also encourage the panelists to prepare remarks not more than 3 minutes, and if you can go even shorter, that's great, so that we can continue with the flow of the conversation, as we don't have too much time left. But I just want to note Masiwa Gunda's question and this framing that acknowledges that an apology on the part of perpetrators is often kind of matched with the demand for reparations among survivors. And the question that attends to that observation is, what does that mean in terms of reparations? Are reparations dependent on the whims of perpetrators, or on the capacity of survivors to demand? And so we invite you to think about that question as you are responding. Also, another question with respect to reparations and reparatory justice is whether that requires material and or financial compensation to the aggrieved. And we thank Reverend Ajime Nelson for that question. And we are also grateful for Reverend Larry Pickens' framing of this question with respect to reparations. How can we work across geographical boundaries in shaping strategies for reparatory justice? And what are the barriers and or opportunities for that work? And it's wonderful that we have a panel that is reflective of various places and parts of the globe that can help us to engage this question of transnational possibilities together. And so I'd like to, with that, turn first to Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, and she'll be followed by Reverend Dr. Iva Carruthers, Ms. Schuler, and Reverend Wells.
Thank you so much for this very important conversation around reparatory justice. Reparatory justice has to be one of the priority areas of the forum, because we cannot stress enough the importance of redress for the egregious injustices and atrocities committed against African descendants due to slavery and to colonialism. It certainly is about the restoring the dignity of the ancestors. Further, reparatory justice is based in biblical and theological hermeneutics. We can see story after story in scriptures and in the interpretation of scriptures that enlighten the importance of not only the confession and profession of our faith, but how it is we actually repent and turn, metanoia, have that way of turning to new ways for reconciliation to occur. Reconciliation can only happen, which is what WCC talks about, reconciliation, until we face the injuries and the harms toward one another. And I will also add toward creation. So for me, reparatory justice is foundational to the conversation. Now, reparations, which is an action or a way forward for addressing reparatory justice, has to also be discussed. And it needs to be discussed in frameworks like the permanent forum, where you deal with both the moral and the legal questions that also have theological import for those of us who are people of faith. Each context in various global communities has particular narratives, particular stories, as we've talked about it earlier, that need to be heard, that need to be shared. And again, moving from victim rights to human rights, those persons who have been disproportionately affected by the issues of the egregious crimes and injuries need to be heard. They need to be in the driver's seat of saying, what is it that with the persons and the structures that have oppressed, depressed, and have need to engage what it means for that redress to occur. So I would say that the permanent forum's role is to convene the intersectional groups, the intersectional laws and legalities that operate in various member state fora, to understand what it is people on the ground, people disproportionately affected, are saying about what it means to redress the injuries, the harms, and the damages of groups that we can name in this space, but in particular spaces in the various global communities. So it's key to opening the door for reconciliation even to occur. So I hope the permanent forum, and it's my understanding that it is very much on the agenda as it kicks off next week, will be key to how it is we find strategies and actions to implement the affirmations that are in the declaration and that have been discussed over 20 plus years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mama Iva.
Yes, and I would just say ditto to my dear sister, and to extend what she has said, to suggest that the forum can really act to be a witness. And that is the convening power and the listening power and the capacity to come into the communities and be present. And by their presence, in the tradition of Brazilian proverbial wisdom, your very presence makes space for our legitimate story to be heard and to be told. But there's another part of that, and I think that speaks to the reciprocity. And that reciprocity means that those of us on the outside have got to continue to find ways to fund and support the work of the forum, independent of whether or not we can get reparations from those who have benefited from the harm that has been done. And that speaks to another question I think that came to the floor. We must continue, as the old folks used to say, keep the fires burning. And we have to keep the fires burning because it's in our interest to keep the fires burning. And to keep the fires burning means for us to, regardless of what happens, to stay on the battlefield and make that demand. Reconciliation cannot occur as a flyover. For you to say you apologize by letting the persons who you did harm write the apology for you means that you have neither professed or confessed. And so we have to understand that and stand up for that and make the moral case and make the prophetic case that this will not be the way that we are going to accept a notion of reparatory justice by any definition. And I think this notion of data becomes important because disaggregating the data becomes a double-edged sword. On the one hand, and this is part of the lessons learned, the mulattoization of Brazil became a mythology about this is a racial democracy, when in fact it was probably second, or if not equal to, the apartheid system of South Africa based on color. And so we learned that the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa was a lot about truth that opened wounds and re-traumatized those who were the victims. It was not a lot about at all the reconciliation part. And we're still struggling with that. A generation of young people who are looking back and say they still got the land. They still have what happened, right? And so I think that what we can celebrate is that if we take the SDGs and juxtapose those against the demands that are coming forth out of the reparatory justice reparations commission, such as CARICOM, and we understand those 10-point demands juxtaposed against SDGs give us direction to what can happen on the ground in terms of praxis projects, whether it's about reclaiming the artifacts that were stolen, or whether it's about the redistribution of the land, whether it's about housing access, like in Evanston, Illinois, that is connected to the environment and taxes being generated, and the model of Zacchaeus and the tax model for restitution and repairing of the harm. If we can understand that those projects on the ground that are grounded in reparatory justice allow for the reciprocity to show forth in the work that we do together through and with the forum, I think we will do well to push our agenda forward. And so there is not enough money in the world that can be translated to the harm done, but money is necessary, and money ought to be a part of the demand for reparations. And so as we move forward to engage in the redress and repair and reparations and doing the hard work, I hope we go with the ancestral power and wisdom and thanksgiving and gratitude of those who went before us, but also that we embrace a future that suggests that we're creating a new world order, and an order based on the real manifestation of what it means to be human. As opposed to what it means to engage in communities which become purely transactional based on a hierarchy that gives benefit to the few at the expense of the many.
Thank you, Dr. Carruthers. Ms. Schuler.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jennifer. I want to say thank you to Dr. Iva for the mention she made about our reality in terms of Black consciousness in Brazil and the myth of racial democracy that is fortunately nowadays less and less believed, but is still very present. I want to thank all the comments that were made before me. I have not been studying as much the matters related to specific terms of reparation and reparatory justice, but I definitely do understand the crucial element of that. And I think as far as Brazil is concerned, what I mentioned before of this small step that was taken with regards to affirmative action in university and schools for people of African descent and indigenous peoples and other minorities as well in Brazil, I do reckon as a very crucial element for our reality. And I hope in the work that the Permanent Forum is going to do, that the Brazilians that will probably attending and bringing views and perspectives into that forum will also further that conversation and those elements as far as Brazilian reality. But definitely, my friends, reparatory justice is an essential element. And going back to what Angelique was pointing out, I believe that firmly that this element with regards to the churches in Brazil has not yet been addressed in many respects. It seems to me that as a theological approach and understanding and study on reparatory justice from a church's perspective with regards to reconciliation and being together as as one in church community could be also an element that would move us forward in the process. And the last point I would like to mention is that together with several of our brothers and sisters that are even here in this conversation today, we are engaged in the follow-up of the African and African Diaspora Conference that took place last year in October. And in Brazil, we have formed 10 working groups that are related to the 10 areas that were brought up as main areas for discussion and follow-up until 2025. And together with the Lutheran Church and African descent women of the Black Women's Caucus in Brazil and many other organizations in different parts of Brazil, we have formed a working group that is going to discuss reparatory justice. In Brazil, people are calling it reparation, but we know the concept is much wider than that. So I hope in another moment to have the input. We are only starting the discussion, the conversation on that from Protestant, Christian, and also ecumenical and interreligious perspective as well. We have people from different sectors that are involved in that. So I look forward to that and the understandings and knowledge we will, and learnings we will have. And I thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. Reverend Wells?
Yes, I agree with what everyone has said, and I support it. And one of the things that I also think that can be done, because there are many pathways and many ways that we need to engage the subject matter of reparatory justice and regarding the sustainable development agenda. One of those things are, and particularly in the ELCA that we're trying to lift up, is what we do with land, the use of land, and acknowledging that, you know, our church has been declining over the years, and one of our greatest assets has been property, right? And when I think of New York, where I worked for many, many years, and the sale of that land that has been kept up by populations, particularly of people of African descent, and for many, many years, when that was sold, then it goes into this almost hiding place. So I would support, even particularly with the Permanent Forum, a challenge of faith communities to do moral forensic audits, if you will, that would particularly regarding the use of land and the sale of buildings and property to uncover our complicity with gentrification and all of the things that we engage that are also continually contributing to the demise, particularly of people of color, but particularly people of African descent. So one of those things is, you know, we just as much as the apologies, one of the popular things now are the land and labor acknowledgements that we are. And we're finding that some of the biggest fears are becoming using the term stolen land, right? And those kinds of things like that, because that becomes a legal matter, if you will, in some ways. But as a people of faith, it's a moral value. So I think that if we were to use this time as we're seeing the lessening of the need of buildings, if you will, and the reuse of space, but the proceeds from that should be redirected in a way that are clearer and truer to the call and recommitment to create, sustain, and reinvest in African descent communities in particular, and congregations and other ministries to recommit our churches or faith communities to growing in ethnic and racial diversity in all areas. And I think that's one clear pathway that I think we could support the Permanent Forum's objectives and getting them to name it. I don't like this term, but claim it as well.
Thank you so much. And thank you for not only your creativity and imagination, as each of you on the panel have allowed it to take shape in your responses. But thank you also to those who have been listening and active participants in this conversation. We are nearing the close, and so I'd just like to share a few of the questions and comments that we've received in the Q&A, and then we'll turn to a final question or set of questions and offer panelists an opportunity to just offer a closing remark. We hear you, Reverend Nelson, and the question and concern about why governments like the United States are jittery about enforcing or unwilling to enforce the Durban Declaration. And we note also the concern that in 20 years, there has not been, or perhaps there has not been, significant improvement in terms of equality for people of African descent among non-African people. And so we acknowledge that that concern and the questions that are rooted deep within that comment. Also, we're grateful for you, Jeffrey James, for the group that you'll be taking to Bosse, and that you chose to share with us today. And we just want to acknowledge also Nozizwe Madlala Routledge, that yes, that retrospective justice frameworks are important and worthy of our response as well. And those frameworks acknowledge, involve public acknowledgement, truth telling, and making amends in present. And these are elements that have been invoked, though not in that order or organization, through the conversation on reparations, and I'm sure will continue to inspire further conversation going forward. We are thankful also, Limantina Sihalolho. We thank you for your question and comments from North Sumatra, Indonesia, and the concern about the relationship between these conversations on racism and the experiences of people of African descent, and pushing us on the panel to understand and to think about how these issues relate to global colonialism. And also, Dari Rikeo, we thank you for your concerns and your questions and the interest that you bring from Solomon Islands, a Black nation in the Pacific. We're grateful for the global reach of this moment and this conversation. And we just want to return to the question that Dr. Evelyn Parker asks, when going back to the WCC Central Committee, what priorities need to be taken from a conversation like this one? And two, in these final moments, we just invite your comments, panelists, in brief on this question of what needs to be done in order to realize the promises and the aspirations of the DDPA. What would the forum need to achieve? What issues would it need to tackle? And I'd invite you just to even name one that you hope would be the most significant or the key to the contributions going forward. And how will the WGEPAD work together with and support the forum during the remaining years in the decade for people of African descent and beyond? And so we'll just return to each of you in this order: Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, Reverend Dr. Iva Carruthers, Ms. Schuler, Reverend Lamont Wells, and Dr. Raj, and invite each of you to respond in brief, and also, as you are doing so, and as we observe a kind of ritual of closing, and as those of you have to go, we thank Nozizwe Madlala Routledge for reminding us of the power of the rallying call to our ancestors who walk with us in this difficult path. And so as you go and depart from this space, I invite you to just name some of the ancestors who are helping in the fight and the cause for racial justice, and to name them in the chat so that their names might be called and that we might remember them as we go. And so I turn to you, Dr. Walker-Smith.
And Dr. Lee, thank you so much for your moderation, and again, for the company of this distinguished panel and all of those who have participated. I simply want to say that the World Council of Churches has made racism a transversal. That is, it is a priority for the World Council of Churches in every and anything we do. And so racism will be a priority going forward until the next assembly. It was adopted at the assembly, the 11th World Assembly in Karlsruhe. And even in my election as president from North America, racism, white supremacy, and white domination was listed as the top priority coming from North America. So just to say that the issues that we're discussing are on the table of priorities for the World Council of Churches. And we have a document called Confronting Racism and Xenophobia, Overcoming Discrimination, Entering Belonging. And we would refer this document to you that you can find online. As for the permanent forum, I'm very pleased that the World Council of Churches has a historic relationship with the United Nations. Having just been at the executive committee of the World Council of Churches, we met with partners at the UN. And so we are walking closely now and in the future with how it is we interface with forums like the Permanent Forum and other mechanisms of the UN to have a comprehensive approach relative to this very timely and important issue, not only of racism, but what it means for us all to be the people of God and to reconcile ourselves unto each other and creation. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. There is a systemic commitment, as I understand it, at World Council, and I'm very honored to serve to be a part of that solidarity going forward for the future. Thank you, Dr. Leith.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Leith, for your wonderful moderation and for your ability to connect the dots and to create this quilted conversation that has been so powerful. I think I come representing the NGO community and the civil society community at the intersection of faith in terms of this work. And so what I lift up as our libation is our vision to create and be at the center of an ecosystem, which will in large part create an infrastructure around which we can do what we have asked ourselves. How do we better curate our resources, our assets, interrogate, and create opportunities for education and our advocacy and our activism? And so through the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, which is a global network of faith leaders in the African American tradition that embraces traditional African religions and its importance and the gaps in the text and in the interpretations that must be brought forth in this century. We are totally committed to that. And in that way, we connect very clearly to the World Council of Churches and the United Nations in the implementation of our work. But I also come from a denomination, the United Church of Christ, which I proudly represent, who has been on the forefront in many ways of this work around dismantling systems of racism. And so as a part of that, I think that we can model the model and be at the table as a partner in doing this work, and will continue to do so. And lastly, a more visionary possibility as we pivot during this moment post George Floyd and COVID is the Center for Reparatory Justice, Transformation, and Remediation, which really represents particularly the affirmation of seminaries and seminary education to be a part of the hub of the way in which we educate next generations to think differently about the intersection of justice and faith. And that there should not be this distinction between I have to either be a justice activist or I have to in some way be one who holds only to the quote biblical truths, understanding that the biblical narrative is deficient if it does not speak to the role of African presence in the Bible and in the narrative, and the role and contribution of traditional quote African religions to the development of systems and understandings, precepts, proverbs, lessons, and text as it relates, including beginning with the ancient Kemetic religions and that complex in what we call the Holy Land, before there was a Suez Canal that defined what it was to be in the Mediterranean. So I come representing and hoping that we can model the model that allows us to collectively as ants eat the elephant. And so I thank you all, and I wish for all of us the peace, the joy, the strength to maintain the hope. And as we know, St. Augustine said, the daughters of hope were both anger and courage. And so here we are with both. Holy rage.
Thank you. Thank you. We turn to you, Ms. Schuler, and ask, as we are at time, past time, if you would please be brief. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. I join Angelique and Dr. Iva to thank you, the graciousness of your moderation and care. Thank you. I was going to say a little more, but I think I will focus more in one element, in two elements actually. That is the pandemic in Brazil, the COVID pandemic, as never before has shown very clearly what is racism in Brazil and who are the poor in Brazil. So the reality of poverty of African descent people has become more than clear to everybody in all TVs at all moments. And I think it's not possible to hide that any longer. So, but I also wanted to say that we had elections just now on the 30th of October, and we will have again a democratic government in Brazil. And we have hope that this democratic government will implement several activities and policies that will be in relation to the most needy in the country, to the poor, to the indigenous peoples, to the people of African descent, to religious freedom, to the care for the environment, and all the many agendas that we have, and also against the struggle against racism, to strengthen that struggle. So I end this word saying that I have hope in my heart that with this new government that we will have as of next year, we will move forward towards a better society in which we will take care of those that are most in need. So I thank you very much for this time and the possibility of being here with you. God bless you all and take care.
Thank you, Ms. Schuler and Reverend Wells.
Okay, thank you so much again. One of the things that that we've been engaging with in the ELCA that I think connects to this, and there are many battlegrounds that we'll be supporting and sessions to attend to have input and make comments. And we've written several statements before. And one of our objectives is to grow newer, younger, and more diverse, right? So one of the things that matters to these populations within our church that we're committed to kind of making an assertive engagement with is related to the sustainable agenda items of the Permanent Forum, particularly regarding the digital divides, racist algorithms, right, and the global commodification of innovations in human behavior data collection. and particularly those disparities in payments and economic access to those kinds of things. So I just wanted to share that you asked for a particular idea, and that's one of those things that we'll kind of be pushing forward among the other battlegrounds that we'd be engaging as well. Again, thank you. This has been great.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Raj, you will have the last word. We invite you to share with us now.
Thank you, Dr. Leith. You've been so kind, and thank you, Segma, and everyone else on the panel. It's been so insightful and just very moving to discuss these issues. I would say from the perspective of the working group and the permanent forum, looking at that, the complementarity of vision and mission is very, very essential in how we do the work, setting up our methods, and how we respond to a lot of the issues. Specifically, I think reparations is a very important topic. Our most recent report on children of African descent talks about how reparatory justice is both a means and an end for the survival, development, protection, and participation of children of African descent. So any measures to design reparations need the full participation and self-determined development of people of African descent. And I'd encourage others to take a look at this report. So I think the Permanent Forum can do more on reparations. It's also very important for us to work collectively on the draft declaration to really move it forward as far as possible. While people claim that declarations are non-binding, actually, if we look at the history of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it really draws from all binding international human rights standards. So it doesn't create new rights, but it creates an interpretation of those rights from the perspective of Indigenous peoples. And these are minimum standards. So similarly, I think there can be significant groundway made in this area by both bodies and through the support from all of you at WCC and broader civil society to push for this. I would also say the histories of the past, acknowledging not only what has happened, but also the contributions that people of African descent have made. When I think about the importance and necessity of teaching about facts and truth of history, I go back to looking at the contribution of the Moors to setting up an advanced multiracial and tolerant civilization in Europe, in Al-Andalus. These are people who came from Africa and parts of the Middle East, and they set the precursor to many scientific advancements that happened during the so-called Age of Enlightenment in Europe. So, it showed what people of African descent did and how they contributed. And that history is not told as much, and that can also change the narrative. So changing the narrative, and I think the Permanent Forum can do a good job of looking at these histories, finding ways to capture them in best practices or good practices, which is part of their mandate. And above all, I think drawing from concrete examples on the ground. So these would just be some ways that going forward, we could prioritize and be impactful. So thank you very much for this time and for such a thoughtful conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you to SEGMA and to the WCC and to the UN for this opportunity. And we go at this point and leave you with the words of Augustine. Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are Anger and Courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are. And so let us go forward in the spirit of these sisters, and may you be blessed, and may your lives be enacting prayer.